Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Tyler Peters adjusted his tie as he waited in the sterile fluorescent glow of Greenfield Pharmacy. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the waiting area where a handful of customers shuffled in quiet desperation. At 34, Tyler had built a reputation as one of the most meticulous financial analysts in Chicago, a man who could spot irregularities in data that others missed. His methodical nature and sharp instinct had earned him a corner office and the respect of his colleagues. But today, he wasn't thinking about spreadsheets or quarterly reports. Casey, his wife of 6 years, stood beside him, her auburn hair catching the light as she scrolled through her phone. She'd been feeling increasingly unwell over the past few months. Chronic fatigue, headaches, and episodes of confusion that their family doctor, Dr. Elias McGrath, had attributed to stress from her demanding job as a pediatric nurse. The prescription she was picking up today was supposed to help with what McGrath had diagnosed as early-onset anxiety disorder with minor cognitive symptoms. Tyler had always been protective of Casey, but lately, his concern had deepened into something closer to alarm. The woman who had once worked 12-hour shifts with boundless energy now struggled to stay awake through dinner. The quick-witted nurse, who could juggle multiple critical patients, now forgot simple conversations they'd had the day before. Next, called Joe Sullivan, the pharmacist Tyler had come to know over their frequent visits. Sullivan was a burly man in his 50s with graying temples and sharp blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He'd been working at this location for over 15 years, and Tyler had noticed he always took extra care with their prescriptions, often double-checking details that other pharmacists might rush through. Casey approached the counter with their insurance cards. "Picking up for Casey Peters," she said, her voice slightly hoarse, another recent development that worried Tyler. Sullivan's fingers flew across the keyboard, but when Casey's profile appeared on his screen, his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Tyler, trained to notice the smallest details, caught the moment of hesitation, the slight tightening around Sullivan's eyes. "Mrs. Peters," Sullivan said carefully, "I need to verify your address. Could you step outside for just a moment? Sometimes our system has trouble with the street names in your neighborhood." Casey looked puzzled but nodded. "Of course." She glanced back at Tyler. "I'll be right outside." As soon as Casey disappeared through the automatic doors, Sullivan leaned forward, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "Sir, do not let her take this. Read the note on the receipt." He handed Tyler a sealed envelope along with the prescription bag. "Open it somewhere safe." Tyler's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" "Not here," Sullivan said, glancing around nervously. "Too many eyes. But your wife, she's in danger. That medication isn't what you think it is." Before Tyler could ask another question, Casey was walking back in, a confused smile on her face. "That was quick. They said the address was fine." Sullivan's demeanor instantly shifted back to professional cheerfulness. "All set, Mrs. Peters. Take 1 tablet daily with food, and call if you have any questions." Tyler's mind raced as they walked to the parking lot. His analytical brain was already cataloging anomalies: Sullivan's behavior, the sealed note, the mysterious address verification that took 30 seconds. Most concerning was the way Sullivan had looked at the medication order. Not like a routine prescription, but like something that genuinely alarmed him. In the car, Casey immediately reached for the prescription bag. "Finally, maybe this will help with these headaches." "Wait," Tyler said, gently taking the bag from her hands. "Let's get home first. I want to read through all the side effects and interactions." Casey laughed weakly. "You and your research. It's just anxiety medication, honey." But Tyler was already thinking about Sullivan's warning. In his work, he'd learned that when someone with nothing to gain took a significant risk to share information, it was usually because they discovered something genuinely dangerous. And Joe Sullivan, a man who'd built his career on pharmaceutical accuracy, had just risked his professional reputation to warn them. As they drove home to their modest 2-story house in the suburbs, Tyler made a mental note of every detail from the pharmacy visit. The way Sullivan had isolated Casey, the specific wording of his warning, the careful timing of the address verification ruse. Most telling was Sullivan's genuine fear. Tyler had seen that look before in whistleblowers at corporations he'd investigated. At home, Casey headed straight for the kitchen to start dinner, her movements slower and more deliberate than they used to be. Tyler watched her with new eyes, noting symptoms he'd previously attributed to work stress. The slight tremor in her hands, the way she paused mid-task, as if forgetting what she was doing. The dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. "I'm going to change clothes," Tyler announced, clutching the sealed envelope. In their bedroom, with the door closed, Tyler carefully opened Sullivan's note. What he saw made his hands shake. "Mr. Peters, your wife's prescription has been altered. The medication she's been taking contains experimental compounds not approved for civilian use. Dr. McGrath has been increasing dosages over time. This batch contains enough to cause permanent neurological damage. I've copied her full prescription history. She's been poisoned slowly over 6 months. I can't report this through normal channels. McGrath has connections. You need to involve law enforcement immediately. I'm risking everything to tell you this. Don't let her take another dose. J. Sullivan." Attached to the note were photocopied records showing Casey's prescription history. Tyler's financial training kicked in as he analyzed the data. The dosages had indeed been steadily increasing, and there were chemical compounds listed that he didn't recognize, but their scientific names suggested they were far more complex than simple anxiety medication. Tyler's hands clenched into fists as the full implications hit him. Someone had been systematically poisoning his wife, using her trust in the medical system against her. And that someone was Dr. Elias McGrath, a man they'd both trusted implicitly for 3 years. But Tyler's anger was tempered by his analytical nature. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was methodical, calculated, and ongoing, which meant McGrath had a specific motive, and Casey wasn't his only victim. Tyler's mind was already working, formulating a plan. He wouldn't just expose McGrath. He would destroy him completely. First, he needed to ensure Casey's safety without alarming her. Then he would gather evidence. And finally, he would make sure that Dr. Elias McGrath faced consequences that fit the magnitude of his crimes. Tyler carefully folded the note and prescription records, hiding them in his home office safe. As he heard Casey moving around downstairs, he made a silent promise. Whoever was responsible for this would learn that they had chosen the wrong man's wife to target. Tyler barely slept that night. He lay beside Casey, listening to her labored breathing and watching for any signs of distress, while his mind worked through what he'd learned. Every few hours, he'd gently check her pulse, relieved each time to find it steady and strong. By dawn, he'd formed the outline of a plan that would require all of his analytical skills and more courage than he'd ever needed in his corporate investigations. Casey woke with another headache, reaching instinctively for the new prescription on her nightstand. Tyler's hand intercepted hers. "Let's wait until after breakfast," he suggested casually. "I read that these medications work better on a full stomach." She nodded absently, too tired to argue. As she showered, Tyler quickly replaced the dangerous pills with harmless vitamin B tablets he'd found in their medicine cabinet. They were similar enough in size and color that Casey wouldn't notice the difference, at least not immediately. After Casey left for her shift at the children's hospital, Tyler called in sick to his office, the first time he'd done so in over 2 years. Then he drove back to Greenfield Pharmacy, arriving just as Joe Sullivan was opening for the day. "Mr. Peters," Sullivan said nervously as Tyler approached the counter. "I wasn't sure you'd." "We need to talk," Tyler interrupted quietly. "Somewhere private." Sullivan glanced around the empty pharmacy, then led Tyler to a small office behind the prescription counter. The room was cramped, filled with medical reference books and controlled substance logs that spoke to Sullivan's meticulous nature. "How long have you known?" Tyler asked without preamble. Sullivan rubbed his temples. "I started noticing irregularities about 2 months ago. Your wife's prescriptions, they weren't coming through normal channels. Dr. McGrath was calling them in personally, using override codes that bypassed our usual verification systems. What made you investigate further?" Professional curiosity at first, Sullivan admitted. Then I started researching the compounds he was prescribing. Some of them aren't even legal for human testing yet. That's when I realized what was happening. Tyler pulled out a notebook, a habit from his financial work. Tell me everything about Dr. McGrath. His background, his connections, anything unusual you've noticed. Sullivan leaned back in his chair. Elias McGrath came to town about 4 years ago. Set up a practice quickly, got hospital privileges fast, too fast for someone without local connections. He drives a car worth more than most doctors make in a year, and his office is equipped with experimental diagnostic equipment that costs a fortune. Any idea where his money comes from? That's the thing, Sullivan said, his voice dropping. I have a friend who works in medical billing. McGrath's patient load shouldn't generate enough revenue for his lifestyle, but he gets a lot of out-of-state visitors, people who fly in specifically to see him. Tyler's analytical mind was already making connections. How many other patients like Casey have you seen? Sullivan's face darkened. At least 12 over the past year. All women between 25 and 40. All started with vague symptoms like fatigue and confusion. All ended up on increasingly complex medication regimens. Tyler asked sharply. 2 of them died, Sullivan whispered, officially from complications of their underlying conditions. But I kept their prescription records. The drug combinations McGrath prescribed, they weren't treatments. They were experiments. Tyler felt a cold rage building in his chest, but he forced himself to maintain control. I need copies of everything you have. I can't. That would be a felony. Patient privacy laws. Joe, Tyler said firmly, my wife is going to die if we don't stop this. And so are other women. How many more deaths are you willing to have on your conscience? Sullivan stared at him for a long moment, then unlocked a filing cabinet. I've been keeping copies off the books, he admitted. I knew someday someone would need this evidence. For the next hour, Sullivan walked Tyler through a pattern of systematic medical abuse that was staggering in its scope. McGrath wasn't just experimenting on individual patients. He was running what amounted to unauthorized human trials, using women's trust in the medical system to test dangerous combinations of experimental drugs. The worst part, Sullivan explained, is that he's clever about it. He stages the experiments to look like legitimate treatment for common conditions. Anxiety, depression, chronic fatigue, symptoms that are hard to verify objectively. Tyler photographed every document with his phone, his hands steady despite the fury building inside him. What about the other pharmacies in town? Is he using them too? No, that's another red flag. He sends all his experimental prescriptions here, probably because he thinks I don't pay attention. But he uses other pharmacies for normal medications, pain relievers, antibiotics, things that don't require special handling. After copying the evidence, Tyler sat back and studied the pattern. McGrath was smart, methodical, and well-connected enough to operate with impunity. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd assumed that a small-town pharmacist wouldn't notice his scheme, and he'd underestimated the intelligence of his victims' families. Joe, I need you to do something for me, Tyler said. Can you delay filling any more of McGrath's experimental prescriptions? Make excuses, supply shortages, insurance verification issues, anything that buys time. Sullivan nodded. I've already started. Told his office we're having system problems. Tyler stood to leave, then turned back. One more question. You said McGrath has connections. What kind? I'm not sure, Sullivan admitted. But I've seen him talking to people who don't look like typical medical professionals. Expensive suits, government plates on their cars. And there's something else. He gets shipments from overseas pharmaceutical companies that don't go through normal import channels. Driving home, Tyler's mind raced through the implications. McGrath wasn't just a rogue doctor. He was part of something larger, possibly involving illegal drug trials funded by foreign interests. The scope of the conspiracy was bigger than Tyler had initially imagined, which meant he needed to be smarter and more careful than he'd ever been in his life. But also meant that when McGrath fell, he would fall hard. Tyler spent the rest of the day researching everything he could find about Dr. Elias McGrath. His medical license had been issued in 3 different states, each time after complaints in the previous location. His educational background checked out, but there were gaps in his employment history that suggested he'd been involved in research that wasn't publicly documented. Most interesting was McGrath's financial situation. Tyler's skills in forensic accounting revealed a pattern of income that didn't match his declared patient load. Money was flowing into McGrath's accounts from shell companies and offshore sources, classic signs of illegal activity. When Casey came home that evening, she looked slightly better than she had in weeks. The vitamin substitution was already having an effect, confirming Tyler's suspicion that McGrath medications had been causing her decline. "How are you feeling?" Tyler asked, studying her face carefully. "Actually, a little better," Casey said with surprise. "My headache is almost gone, and I didn't have any of those weird, dizzy spells today." Tyler smiled, masking his rage with genuine relief. "That's great, honey. Maybe the new medication is working." That night, Tyler lay awake planning his next moves. He had evidence of McGrath's crimes, but not enough to guarantee a conviction. He needed more, something that would expose not just McGrath, but the entire network he was part of. And Tyler wanted more than just justice. He wanted McGrath to suffer the way Casey had suffered, to experience the same helplessness and fear that his victims had endured. The plan forming in Tyler's mind was ambitious and dangerous. But as he listened to Casey's peaceful breathing beside him, the first truly restful sleep she'd had in months, he knew he would do whatever it took to protect her and stop McGrath from hurting anyone else. McGrath had chosen the wrong woman to experiment on, and he was about to learn that Tyler Peters was not a man who forgave or forgot. Tyler's investigation intensified over the following week. Using his position at the financial firm, he ran background checks and traced money flows that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of Dr. McGrath's operation. Casey continued to improve daily on the vitamin substitutes, her energy returning and her mental clarity sharpening, proof that McGrath's treatments had been slowly destroying her. The breakthrough came when Tyler decided to investigate McGrath's property holdings. Using public records and his access to financial databases, he discovered that McGrath owned a private research facility outside town, purchased through a web of shell companies that led back to a pharmaceutical conglomerate with known ties to illegal human testing. On Thursday evening, Tyler told Casey he was working late and drove to the facility. Hidden among a cluster of warehouses in an industrial district, the building looked innocuous from the outside, just another medical office complex. But Tyler's trained eye noticed details that didn't fit. Security cameras that belonged on a government facility, not a medical practice, and a parking lot filled with cars bearing license plates from multiple states. Tyler parked across the street and used his telephoto camera lens to document everything he could see. Over the course of 3 hours, he watched a steady stream of women entering the building, all fitting the same profile as Casey and McGrath's other victims. Young, professional, trusting. But what made Tyler's blood run cold was recognizing one of the women, Amanda McLaughlin, a teacher from Casey's yoga class who had mentioned feeling under the weather lately and starting treatment with a new doctor. Tyler's phone buzzed with a text from Joe Sullivan. "Emergency. Can you meet me at the pharmacy after hours?" Back in trance. 20 minutes later, Tyler found Sullivan waiting in the pharmacy's rear parking lot, his face pale with anxiety. "They know," Sullivan said without preamble. "McGrath's people called today asking detailed questions about our conversation. They're getting suspicious." "What did you tell them?" "That we only discussed your wife's medication schedule." "But Tyler, there's something else. I got a call from Amanda McLaughlin's husband this afternoon. She collapsed at work and is in the ICU. Her symptoms match what I was seeing in your wife's progression." Tyler's fists clenched. "How many others are there right now?" "Active patients of McGrath's who are in immediate danger." Sullivan pulled out a handwritten list. 14 that I know of. And based on the prescription timeline, 3 of them are at critical stages. Tyler studied the list, memorizing every name. "Joe, I need you to do something that might cost you your license. I need you to contact these women's families and warn them, the same way you warned me." "I can't." "Yes, you can," Tyler said firmly. "Because if you don't, some of these women are going to die. And when this all comes out, and it will come out, how are you going to live with yourself knowing you could have prevented it?" Sullivan was quiet for a long moment. "What's your plan?" I'm going to expose everything. But I need more evidence, and I need to make sure McGrath can't destroy records or disappear when he realizes we're onto him. He's planning something, Sullivan said. I overheard one of his assistants on the phone today. They're talking about accelerating the timeline and completing Phase 3 trials. Tyler's analytical mind processed this new information. Phase 3 trials meant McGrath was close to completing whatever illegal research he was conducting, which meant he would soon have no more use for his current test subjects. I need to get inside that facility, Tyler said. That's insane. It's too dangerous. Not as dangerous as letting him continue. Tyler pulled out his phone and showed Sullivan the photos he'd taken. Look at this place, Joe. This isn't a small operation. McGrath is part of something bigger, and Casey isn't just a victim. She's a test subject in an illegal drug trial that could affect thousands of people if it's allowed to continue. Over the next hour, Tyler and Sullivan developed a plan. Sullivan would begin contacting the families of McGrath's other victims, using his position as their pharmacist to arrange consultations where he could warn them privately. Meanwhile, Tyler would gather the evidence needed to bring down not just McGrath, but the entire network he was working for. The next morning, Tyler called in another sick day and drove to the county courthouse to research McGrath's business licenses and permits. What he found confirmed his worst fears. The research facility was licensed for pharmaceutical compatibility testing, a vague designation that could cover almost anything. More disturbing were the permits for handling biological waste disposal and controlled substance research, indicators that whatever was happening at the facility involved dangerous materials and potentially lethal drugs. Tyler then spent the afternoon visiting 3 of the addresses on Sullivan's list, posing as an insurance investigator conducting routine policy reviews. What he found broke his heart. Families dealing with wives and daughters who were experiencing the same decline Casey had suffered, all trusting that Dr. McGrath's treatments would eventually help. At the home of Joyce Morton, a 28-year-old graphic designer, Tyler met her husband Walter, who was desperate for answers about his wife's deteriorating condition. She used to be so vibrant, Walter explained as they sat in his living room while Joyce slept upstairs. Now she can barely stay awake through the day. Dr. McGrath keeps saying it's a rare autoimmune condition, but the medications don't seem to help. Tyler carefully explained what he discovered, showing Walter the evidence Sullivan had provided. The man's face went through the same progression Tyler had experienced: disbelief, anger, and finally, determination. "What can I do?" Walter asked. "Get your wife away from McGrath immediately," Tyler said. "Make up any excuse, second opinion, insurance issues, family emergency. Just stop the treatments and document everything." By the end of the day, Tyler had spoken with 6 families and found the same pattern in each case. Women in their prime being systematically poisoned by someone they trusted completely. That evening, as Casey prepared dinner with energy Tyler hadn't seen in months, he made a decision that would change everything. He wasn't just going to expose McGrath's crimes. He was going to make sure the doctor experienced the same helplessness and fear his victims had endured. Tyler had spent his career solving complex puzzles and identifying patterns others missed. Now he would use those same skills to construct a trap that McGrath wouldn't see coming until it was too late. The plan taking shape in Tyler's mind was elaborate and would require precise timing. But when it was complete, Dr. Elias McGrath would learn that some people fought back, and when they did, they fought to win. As Tyler watched Casey laughing at something on TV, the first genuine laughter he'd heard from her in months, he felt his resolve crystallize into something unbreakable. McGrath had taken nearly a year of his wife's life and threatened to take much more. Now Tyler Peters was going to take everything McGrath had. 3 weeks into his investigation, Tyler had gathered enough evidence to convince any prosecutor, but he sensed there were deeper layers to McGrath's operation that remained hidden. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Charlie Conley, a private investigator Tyler had worked with during corporate fraud cases. "You've stumbled onto something bigger than you realize," Charlie said as they met at a downtown coffee shop. Tyler had hired him to conduct surveillance on McGrath's facility and dig into the doctor's background through channels Tyler couldn't access. Charlie slid a thick folder across the table. McGrath isn't just running illegal drug trials. He's part of a human trafficking network that specializes in medical experimentation. The women he targets aren't random. They're specifically selected based on genetic markers and health profiles. Tyler's blood chilled as he opened the folder. Inside were surveillance photos showing McGrath meeting with men in expensive suits, documents indicating wire transfers from overseas pharmaceutical companies, and most damning, a list of over 40 women who had been treated by McGrath over the past 3 years. 12 of them are dead, Charlie continued quietly. Official causes of death range from heart failure to sudden neurological events, but the timing corresponds perfectly with the progression of McGrath's experimental treatments. Why hasn't anyone noticed the pattern? Because McGrath is smart about geographic distribution. He moves between 3 different states, sets up practice in small towns where one doctor's death rate doesn't trigger statistical alarms. By the time anyone might notice, he's already moved on. Tyler studied the photographs of McGrath with his associates. Who are these people? Best I can determine, representatives from Apex Pharmaceutical Research, a company with ties to several foreign governments. They're paying McGrath to conduct trials that would be impossible to get approved through legitimate channels. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. McGrath wasn't just a road doctor. He was part of an international network that used American women as unwitting test subjects for experimental drugs, then disposed of the evidence by letting the victims die from natural causes. There's more, Charlie said. McGrath has been building profiles on the husbands and families of his victims. He targets women married to men who are unlikely to ask difficult questions. Men who trust the medical system and don't have the resources or knowledge to investigate properly. Tyler's hands clenched, except he chose wrong this time. Very wrong. But Tyler, these people have killed to protect their operation. If they realize you're a threat, let them come, Tyler said quietly. I'm done being careful. That afternoon, Tyler received a call from Joe Sullivan with urgent news. McGrath just placed a massive order for a drug compound I've never seen before. The chemical formula suggests it's designed to cause rapid organ failure that would mimic natural disease progression. How many doses? Enough for every woman currently in his program. Tyler, I think he's planning to eliminate all the current test subjects and disappear. Tyler's mind raced. McGrath was preparing to close down his operation, which meant Casey and 13 other women were in immediate mortal danger. The time for careful investigation had passed. Now, Tyler needed to act. Joe, I need you to stall that order. Tell them you need additional authorization from the DEA or make up any bureaucratic delay you can think of. Already done, but I can only buy maybe 48 hours before they get suspicious. Tyler's plan had been evolving for weeks, but now it crystallized into something concrete and deadly. He wouldn't just expose McGrath. He would use the doctor's own methods against him. That evening, Tyler told Casey he was taking a business trip for the weekend. Just some client meetings in Springfield. I'll be back Sunday night. Casey, who had been feeling so much better lately, smiled and kissed him goodbye. Don't work too hard. You seem stressed lately. If only she knew, Tyler thought as he watched her return to her book. One of many activities she'd regained the energy for since stopping McGrath's medications. Instead of driving to Springfield, Tyler checked into a motel outside town and spent the night preparing. Using his corporate contacts and Charlie's surveillance equipment, he had identified the location where McGrath stored his experimental drugs and kept detailed records of his research. The facility was in the basement of an abandoned medical building that McGrath had purchased through one of his shell companies. Security was minimal. McGrath's arrogance had convinced him that his operation was too secret and sophisticated for anyone to discover. McGrath was wrong. At 2 a.m., Tyler entered the facility through a service entrance that Charlie's reconnaissance had identified as vulnerable. The basement was a maze of laboratory equipment, file cabinets, and refrigerated storage units containing enough illegal pharmaceutical compounds to supply a small hospital. But what Tyler found in McGrath's office made him physically sick. Detailed files on each victim, including photographs tracking their physical deterioration, notes on psychological changes, and clinical observations written with the detached precision of someone who viewed human beings as laboratory specimens. Casey's file was particularly extensive. McGrath had been documenting her decline with scientific thoroughness, noting how different drug combinations affected her mood, energy levels, and cognitive function. The final entry, dated just days before Sullivan's warning, read, "Subject shows optimal response to compound series. Ready for terminal phase protocol." Terminal phase protocol. McGrath had been planning to kill Casey. Tyler photographed everything, but he also did something else. Using his knowledge of McGrath's system and the chemical compounds available in the laboratory, he prepared a special mixture, one that would give McGrath a taste of his own medicine. The beauty of Tyler's plan was its simplicity. McGrath had spent years learning how to poison people slowly and undetectably. Now Tyler would use that same knowledge to ensure that McGrath experienced exactly what his victims had endured: the gradual loss of health, the confusion, the growing fear as his body betrayed him. But Tyler's version would be faster and more targeted. McGrath would have time to understand what was happening to him, time to feel the helplessness his victims had experienced, but not time to develop an antidote or escape. As Tyler prepared to leave the facility, he made one final discovery that sealed McGrath's fate. In a locked filing cabinet, he found contracts with Apex Pharmaceutical detailing plans to expand the operation to include children. McGrath wasn't just a monster who preyed on women. He was planning to start experimenting on kids. Tyler's resolve hardened into something unbreakable. McGrath had forfeited any right to mercy the moment he decided to target children. Now Tyler would make sure the doctor paid for every life he'd destroyed and every future crime he'd planned. The next phase of Tyler's plan would require perfect timing and nerves of steel. But Tyler Peters had never backed down from a challenge, and he wasn't about to start now. Dr. Elias McGrath was about to learn that some people fought back, and when they did, they fought to win. Tyler spent Saturday morning in his home office, organizing the evidence he'd gathered into a comprehensive case file that would destroy McGrath and his associates. But documentation wasn't enough. Tyler wanted McGrath to suffer the way his victims had suffered, to experience the fear and helplessness that Casey and the other women had endured. The plan Tyler had developed was elegant in its simplicity. McGrath trusted his own expertise completely, believing himself untouchable because of his medical knowledge and powerful connections. That arrogance would be his downfall. At noon, Tyler made a call to McGrath's office using a voice modulation app on his phone. He identified himself as Dr. Kenneth Hurst from Apex Pharmaceutical Research, requesting an urgent meeting to discuss accelerating the timeline for Phase 3 completion. McGrath's assistant put Tyler through immediately. "Dr. Hurst, I wasn't expecting your call until next week," McGrath said, his voice carrying the smooth confidence Tyler had come to despise. "There have been developments," Tyler replied, carefully modulating his voice to match the professional tone he'd heard in Charlie's surveillance recordings. "The board is concerned about increased scrutiny from federal agencies. We need to complete current trials and sanitize the research facility within 72 hours. Tyler could hear McGrath's sharp intake of breath. "That's impossible. The subjects aren't ready for terminal protocols." "Make them ready," Tyler interrupted. "And we need you to personally oversee the disposal of all physical evidence. Our contact will meet you at the facility tomorrow night at 11 p.m. with final payment and extraction arrangements." After hanging up, Tyler smiled grimly. McGrath's greed and paranoia would drive him to the meeting, where Tyler would be waiting with a very different kind of conclusion to their relationship. That afternoon, Tyler visited Walter Rowe, whose wife Joyce was one of McGrath's more recent victims. Tyler had been working with Walter to document Joyce's decline and gather evidence of McGrath's methods. "How is she doing?" Tyler asked as they sat in Walter's kitchen. "Better, actually. We took your advice and stopped seeing McGrath. Told him we needed a second opinion. Joyce's energy has been coming back gradually." Tyler nodded. "Good. Walter, I need to ask you to do something that might seem strange. I need you to call McGrath's office tomorrow morning and schedule an emergency appointment for Monday. Tell them Joyce had a severe reaction to stopping her medication and needs immediate intervention." Walter looked confused. "But we know the medication was making her worse." "Exactly. But McGrath doesn't know that we know. He'll see Joyce's relapse as proof that his patients can't survive without his treatments. It will make him overconfident and careless. Over the next hour, Tyler walked Walter through his role in the larger plan. Walter would be one of several family members creating distractions and complications that would force McGrath to make mistakes, exposing himself to the legal consequences Tyler had prepared. What about the other families? Walter asked. Joe Sullivan has been contacting them all week. By Monday morning, McGrath will be dealing with multiple medical emergencies from patients whose families are suddenly asking difficult questions about their treatments. Tyler's plan was designed to overwhelm McGrath's ability to maintain his careful facade. When people were stressed and panicked, they made errors that revealed their true nature. Sunday evening, Tyler kissed Casey goodbye and told her he was meeting a client for a late dinner. Casey, now feeling almost completely back to her normal self, barely looked up from the medical journal she was reading, another sign of her returning mental acuity. "Don't be too late," she said absently. "I want to hear about your business trip." Tyler drove to the abandoned medical facility where McGrath stored his research materials. Using the access codes he'd observed during his previous infiltration, Tyler entered the building and made his way to the basement laboratory. The space was exactly as he'd left it, filled with equipment and substances that represented years of human suffering. Tyler had spent the week studying McGrath's methods, learning how the doctor had slowly poisoned his victims with compounds that mimicked natural disease progression. Now Tyler would use that same knowledge for justice. At 10:45 p.m., Tyler heard footsteps in the corridor above. McGrath had arrived early, probably to prepare for what he thought would be a meeting with his apex pharmaceutical contact. Tyler smiled as he heard the doctor's confident footsteps descending to the basement laboratory. "Dr. Hurst," McGrath called as he entered the lab. "I wasn't expecting you to be here yet." Tyler stepped out of the shadows, his face calm despite the rage burning in his chest. "Hello, Dr. McGrath. I'm not Dr. Hurst." McGrath's face went through a rapid sequence of expressions: confusion, recognition, and finally, fear. "Mr. Peters, what are you doing here?" "I'm here to discuss my wife's treatment," Tyler said calmly, "and the treatment of 13 other women you've been slowly murdering." McGrath's hand moved toward his phone, but Tyler was faster. Years of staying in shape and the adrenaline of righteous anger gave Tyler speed and strength that the sedentary doctor couldn't match. "Sit down," Tyler commanded, gesturing to a chair in the center of the lab. "We have a lot to discuss." McGrath's eyes darted around the lab, looking for escape routes or weapons. "Mr. Peters, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding," Tyler said, "was yours. You thought you could experiment on my wife without consequences. You thought you could kill women and hide behind your medical credentials. You were wrong." Tyler pulled out a syringe filled with a clear liquid, one of McGrath's own experimental compounds, modified using the doctor's own research notes. "This contains a fascinating cocktail of the same substances you've been giving Casey, but I've concentrated the dosage and accelerated the timeline." McGrath's face went pale. "You can't do this. I'm a doctor." "So were the Nazi doctors at Mengel's camps," Tyler said coldly. "That didn't make their experiments any less evil." For the next hour, Tyler methodically dismantled McGrath's psychological defenses, forcing the doctor to confront the full scope of his crimes. Tyler showed him photographs of every woman who had died, read excerpts from medical records documenting their suffering, and described the impact on their families. "Please," McGrath finally whispered, "I can make this right. I can provide antidotes, testify against Apex Pharmaceutical, expose the entire network." "You can and you will," Tyler agreed. "But first, you're going to experience what your victims experienced." Tyler injected McGrath with a carefully calculated dose of the doctor's own experimental compound. Not enough to kill him, but enough to cause the same neurological symptoms that Casey and the others had endured. "What have you done to me?" McGrath gasped as the drug took effect. "I've given you a choice," Tyler said. "You can sit here and let the compound run its course, experiencing the same confusion and helplessness your victims felt. Or you can cooperate fully with the authorities and spend whatever time you have left making amends for your crimes. As McGrath began to show the early symptoms of his own experimental protocol, tremors, disorientation, and growing panic, Tyler placed a digital recorder on the table. "Start talking," Tyler commanded. "Everything. The names of your contacts at Apex Pharmaceutical, the locations of other research facilities, the complete list of women you've experimented on. Leave out one detail, and I walk away and let you discover exactly how effective your own research has been." McGrath, now experiencing firsthand the terror his victims had lived with for months, began to confess everything. Tyler Peters had spent his career solving complex puzzles, but this was the most satisfying solution he'd ever achieved. Justice, it turned out, was simply a matter of making sure people experienced the consequences of their own actions. McGrath's confession lasted through the night. As the experimental compound coursed through his system, the doctor experienced the same progressive neurological symptoms he had inflicted on dozens of women. The tremors started first, followed by confusion and memory lapses that left him grasping for words mid-sentence. Tyler sat across from McGrath, methodically recording every detail of the conspiracy. The depth of the operation was staggering. McGrath had been working with Apex Pharmaceutical for over 5 years, conducting illegal human trials in multiple states while building a network of corrupt medical professionals who helped cover his tracks. "The children's program," McGrath whispered during a moment of clarity, his voice shaking from both the drug effects and growing terror. "They wanted to start testing developmental compounds on pediatric subjects. I told them it was too risky, that we needed more time to perfect the adult protocols." Tyler's jaw clenched. "How many children were you planning to experiment on?" 200 in the initial phase, McGrath admitted, his words slurring as the neurological effects intensified. "Kids with learning disabilities, behavioral problems, children whose parents were desperate enough to try experimental treatments." Tyler forced himself to remain calm, though every word from McGrath's mouth made him want to strangle the doctor with his bare hands. Instead, he continued methodically documenting every aspect of the conspiracy, knowing that McGrath's confession would be worthless if Tyler let his emotions compromise the evidence. "Tell me about the other doctors," Tyler demanded. "How many people are part of this network?" McGrath struggled to focus, his pupils dilated and his hands shaking uncontrollably. 15, maybe 20. Dr. Lester Travis in Arizona, Dr. Miguel Jensen in Nevada, Dr. Glenn McLean in Florida. They each run similar operations, targeting different demographic groups. As the night progressed, Tyler learned that McGrath's operation was just one node in a vast network of illegal medical experimentation. Apex Pharmaceutical had been using American citizens as unwitting test subjects for drugs that would eventually be sold to foreign militaries and intelligence agencies. "The compounds we were developing," McGrath continued, his voice becoming more distorted, "they weren't for treating disease. They were for controlling populations. Slow-acting neurological agents that could be introduced into water supplies or food distribution systems." Tyler's blood ran cold. The implications were beyond anything he had imagined. This wasn't just about illegal drug trials. It was about developing weapons for biological warfare. "Who else knows about this?" Tyler pressed. "What government officials are involved?" McGrath's laugh was bitter and broken. "You think governments aren't already aware? Half our funding comes from intelligence agencies who want plausible deniability for research they can't conduct officially." By dawn, Tyler had recorded over 8 hours of detailed confessions covering multiple criminal conspiracies involving dozens of perpetrators and hundreds of victims. McGrath, now experiencing severe cognitive impairment and motor function loss, had revealed the locations of research facilities, bank account numbers, and contact information for his co-conspirators. "Please," McGrath begged, his words barely comprehensible. "The antidote. I can't think clearly. I'm forgetting things." "So did Casey," Tyler said coldly. "So did Joyce Morton and Amanda McLaughlin and every other woman you poisoned. The difference is that they were innocent, and you're getting exactly what you deserve." Tyler checked his watch. It was time for the next phase of his plan. He had what he needed to destroy the entire network, but he wanted to make sure McGrath's downfall was as public and humiliating as his crimes deserved. "Dr. McGrath," Tyler said formally, "I'm going to give you a choice. You can cooperate fully with law enforcement, testify against all your co-conspirators, and spend the rest of your life in prison. Or I can leave you here to experience the full effects of your own experimental protocol." McGrath's eyes, now unfocused and filled with terror, struggled to meet Tyler's gaze. What do you want me to do?" Tyler pulled out his phone and dialed 911. "I want you to confess everything to the police, exactly as you confessed to me. I want you to provide them with all the evidence they need to arrest every person involved in this conspiracy. And I want you to do it knowing that every moment of suffering you experience from now on is a fraction of what you put innocent women through." As sirens approached in the distance, Tyler administered a partial antidote to McGrath, enough to ensure the doctor would be coherent for questioning, but not enough to completely reverse the effects of his own experimental compound. "The police are going to find you here, surrounded by evidence of your crimes, in the midst of a neurological episode caused by your own illegal drugs," Tyler explained. "Your confession will be on record, and all the evidence they need will be in plain sight." Tyler gathered the recording equipment and evidence files, preparing to leave before the authorities arrived. But first, he wanted to ensure McGrath understood the full scope of his defeat. "Your associates at Apex Pharmaceutical are going to abandon you," Tyler said. "They'll deny everything, destroy what evidence they can, and probably arrange for your death in prison to prevent you from testifying. You spent years thinking you were untouchable, but you're about to learn what real powerlessness feels like." McGrath tried to respond, but the words came out as incoherent mumbling. The neurological damage was progressing exactly as Tyler had calculated, enough to make McGrath suffer, but not enough to prevent him from facing justice. As Tyler slipped out of the building through the same service entrance he'd used to get in, he could hear police cars pulling into the parking lot. Soon they would find McGrath in his laboratory of horrors, surrounded by evidence of crimes that would shock even experienced law enforcement officers. Tyler drove home as the sun rose over the city, feeling a satisfaction deeper than anything he'd experienced in his professional career. He had used his analytical skills and methodical nature to solve the most important puzzle of his life, and the solution had been devastating for the people who had threatened everything he cared about. Casey was still sleeping when Tyler quietly entered their bedroom. She looked peaceful and healthy, her color restored and her breathing steady. Tyler watched her for a moment, thinking about how close he had come to losing her to McGrath's evil scheme. Now McGrath would face consequences that would make him understand, for whatever time he had left, what it meant to be powerless and afraid. It was exactly what justice looked like when delivered by someone who understood that some crimes demanded more than just imprisonment. Tyler Peters had set out to protect his wife and expose a conspiracy. He had accomplished both goals with a thoroughness that would serve as a warning to anyone else who might consider targeting innocent people for their own twisted purposes. The trap had been set, sprung, and closed. Now it was time to watch the rest of the network fall. Tyler woke up Monday morning to find Casey already in the kitchen, making breakfast with an energy and focus she hadn't shown in almost a year. She was humming softly while scrambling eggs, completely unaware that her husband had spent the weekend orchestrating the downfall of the man who had nearly killed her. "You're up early for someone who had a late business dinner," Casey observed with a smile. "Couldn't sleep," Tyler said truthfully. "How are you feeling?" "Amazing, actually. I think I've finally turned a corner with whatever was making me sick. Maybe it was just stress after all." Tyler's phone buzzed with a news alert. Local doctor arrested in connection with illegal medical experiments. The story was already breaking, though the full scope of McGrath's crimes wouldn't become public for several more hours. At work, Tyler maintained his normal routine while monitoring news reports and police communications through contacts Charlie Conley had provided. McGrath had been found in his laboratory at 6:15 a.m., suffering from severe neurological symptoms and surrounded by evidence of multiple felonies. The doctor's incoherent rambling had led police to a recording device containing hours of detailed confessions. By noon, Federal agents were executing search warrants at locations across 3 states based on information McGrath had provided during his drug-induced testimony. Tyler's phone rang during his lunch break. It was Joe Sullivan calling from the pharmacy. "Tyler, have you seen the news? They arrested McGrath this morning." "I saw that," Tyler replied carefully. "What are people saying?" "The FBI raided his office this morning and seized all his patient records. They're calling it the largest medical fraud investigation in state history." "But Tyler, there's something else. Agents came by the pharmacy asking about McGrath's prescriptions. They want to interview me this afternoon." "Tell them everything," Tyler said. "This is your chance to make sure McGrath can never hurt anyone again." That afternoon, Tyler received a call from Special Agent Jacqueline Hunt of the FBI's Healthcare Fraud Division. She wanted to interview Tyler and Casey about their experiences with Dr. McGrath. "We understand your wife was a patient of Dr. McGrath's," Agent Hunt said when they met at the federal building downtown. "We're trying to establish a timeline of his illegal activities and identify all potential victims." Tyler had prepared carefully for this moment. "My wife was being treated for anxiety and fatigue. The medications didn't seem to help, so we were considering seeking a second opinion." "Did you ever notice anything unusual about Dr. McGrath's practice? Anything that seemed out of the ordinary?" Tyler pretended to think carefully. "Now that you mention it, he did seem to order a lot of tests that other doctors had said were unnecessary. And Casey's symptoms actually seemed to get worse while she was under his care." Agent Hunt made notes while Tyler provided a carefully edited version of events. He mentioned his concerns about Casey's declining health, the unusual medications McGrath had prescribed, and his growing suspicions about the doctor's methods. "Mr. Peters, we've discovered evidence that Dr. McGrath was conducting unauthorized drug trials using unwitting patients as test subjects. Your wife appears to have been one of those patients." Tyler allowed his face to show shock and anger. "You're saying he was experimenting on Casey without our knowledge?" "That's exactly what we're saying. Dr. McGrath has confessed to using at least 40 women as test subject for experimental pharmaceutical compounds. Several of his victims died from complications related to these unauthorized treatments." Tyler's performance was flawless. The reaction of a man learning for the first time that his wife had been the victim of a monstrous crime. Inside, he felt only satisfaction that McGrath's confession was holding up under federal scrutiny. Over the next several hours, Agent Hunt walked Tyler through McGrath's operation in detail. The FBI had already begun arresting co-conspirators based on the information McGrath had provided during his breakdown. Apex Pharmaceuticals' offices in 3 countries had been raided simultaneously, and several government officials were under investigation for their roles in facilitating the illegal research. "The scope of this conspiracy is unlike anything we've seen," Agent Hunt admitted. Dr. McGrath's group was developing compounds for biological warfare applications, using American citizens as unwitting test subjects. The international implications are staggering. Tyler learned that McGrath's condition had stabilized somewhat, but he was still suffering from significant neurological impairment, a condition that would likely be permanent. The doctor was being held under heavy security at a federal medical facility, both for his own protection and to prevent his co-conspirators from silencing him. "Will he be able to testify?" Tyler asked. "Eventually, yes. His cognitive function is impaired, but he's lucid enough to provide testimony. Ironically, the neurological damage he's experiencing is consistent with exposure to the same compounds he was testing on his victims." Tyler nodded gravely, a fitting end for someone who caused so much suffering. That evening, Tyler arrived home to find Casey watching the news coverage of McGrath's arrest. Her face was pale with shock as reporters described the scope of the doctor's crimes. "Tyler, that's my doctor," Casey said when he walked in. "The man they arrested for those terrible experiments. He's been treating me for months." Tyler sat beside his wife and held her as she processed the reality of what had happened to her. "The FBI wants to interview us both," he said gently. "They think you might have been one of his victims." Casey's hands shook as she looked at the prescription bottles on their coffee table, the same medications Tyler had been replacing with vitamins for weeks. "He was experimenting on me?" "It looks that way. But Casey, you're safe now. He can't hurt you anymore." Over the following days, Tyler watched with satisfaction as McGrath's network crumbled. Apex Pharmaceuticals' stock price collapsed as the full scope of their illegal activities became public. Government officials resigned in disgrace. Medical licenses were revoked across multiple states. Dr. Lester Travis was arrested in Arizona. Dr. Miguel Jensen was found dead in his Nevada office, apparently having taken poison rather than face prosecution. Dr. Glenn McLean attempted to flee to a non-extradition country, but was captured at the airport. The media coverage was relentless. McGrath's victims and their families appeared on television, sharing their stories of mysterious illnesses, declining health, and doctors who seemed more interested in conducting experiments than providing care. Tyler gave several interviews, presenting himself as a concerned husband who had trusted the medical system and nearly lost his wife as a result. His analytical background and articulate presentation made him an effective spokesman for the victims, someone who could explain the complex nature of McGrath crimes in terms the public could understand. The most disturbing aspect of this case, Tyler told a CNN reporter, is how McGrath used our trust against us. We went to him for help, and he saw us as test subjects. The violation of that trust is something that goes beyond just medical malpractice. It's a fundamental betrayal of everything the healing profession is supposed to represent. Behind the scenes, Tyler continued to work with federal investigators, providing information that helped them understand the full scope of McGrath's operation. His financial expertise was particularly valuable in tracing money flows and identifying shell companies used to fund the illegal research. Joe Sullivan became a key witness for the prosecution, his pharmacy records providing crucial evidence of McGrath's systematic poisoning of his patients. Walter Rowe and the other husbands Tyler had contacted formed a support group for families affected by McGrath's crimes. 3 weeks after McGrath's arrest, Tyler received a call from Agent Hunt with an update on the investigation. "We've arrested 23 people so far," she reported. The conspiracy reached into multiple government agencies and international pharmaceutical companies. "Your wife's case has become central to our prosecution strategy because we have such detailed records of McGrath's experimental protocols." "How is McGrath doing?" Tyler asked, though he already knew the answer. "Not well. The neurological damage is extensive and appears to be irreversible. His lawyers are trying to use his condition to argue that he's incompetent to stand trial. But our medical experts believe he's capable of understanding the proceedings and assisting in his defense." Tyler smiled grimly. McGrath would face trial, but he would do so while experiencing the same cognitive decline and physical suffering he had inflicted on his victims. It was a more perfect justice than any court sentence could provide. The trap Tyler had set had exceeded even his own expectations. McGrath was destroyed, his co-conspirators were falling one by one, and the entire conspiracy was being exposed to public scrutiny. Most importantly, Casey was safe and recovering her health daily. Tyler Peters had used his analytical skills and methodical nature to solve the most important puzzle of his life. The solution had been devastating for the people who had threatened everything he cared about, and completely satisfying for a man who understood that some crimes demanded creative justice. 6 months after McGrath's arrest, the trial that would determine his fate finally began. Tyler sat in the federal courthouse gallery, watching as the man who had nearly killed his wife shuffled into the courtroom under heavy guard. McGrath's appearance was shocking. The once confident doctor now moved with the uncertain gait of someone whose nervous system had been permanently damaged. The prosecution's case was devastating in its thoroughness. Lead prosecutor Amanda McLaughlin, no relation to McGrath's victim of the same name, methodically presented evidence of a conspiracy that had reached into the highest levels of government and international pharmaceutical companies. Tyler had been called as a key witness for the prosecution. As he took the stand, he looked directly at McGrath, noting with satisfaction the doctor's unfocused eyes and trembling hands, permanent reminders of the justice Tyler had delivered. "Mr. Peters," Prosecutor McLaughlin began, "please tell the court about your wife's experience with Dr. McGrath." Tyler's testimony was precise and devastating. He described Casey's gradual decline, the mysterious symptoms that worsened despite treatment, and his growing suspicions about McGrath's methods. He presented himself as a concerned husband who had trusted the medical system and nearly lost everything as a result. Did Dr. McGrath ever inform you that he was using your wife as a test subject for experimental drugs? The prosecutor asked. Never, Tyler replied firmly. We trusted him completely. We believed he was trying to help Casey recover for what he said was an anxiety disorder. Tyler's analytical background served him well on the witness stand. He was able to explain complex financial records that showed money flowing from Apex Pharmaceutical to McGrath's various shell companies, demonstrating the monetary motivation behind the doctor's crimes. Under cross-examination, McGrath's defense attorney attempted to portray Tyler as an overly suspicious husband who had misinterpreted legitimate medical treatment. But Tyler's calm demeanor and detailed knowledge of the evidence made him an unshakable witness. Mr. Peters, the defense attorney pressed, isn't it true that you conducted your own investigation into Dr. McGrath's practice? That you broke into his research facility and tampered with evidence? Tyler met the lawyer's gaze steadily. I never broke into any facility. I did conduct research into my wife's condition because I was concerned about her declining health. Any evidence the FBI found was discovered through their own investigation. It was technically true. Tyler had never forced entry into McGrath's facility, having used access codes he'd observed. And while he had tampered with evidence, that evidence had led directly to McGrath's confession and the exposure of the entire conspiracy. Joe Sullivan's testimony was particularly damaging to McGrath's defense. The pharmacist's detailed records showed a clear pattern of increasingly dangerous experimental compounds being prescribed to unwitting patients. Dr. McGrath's orders were unlike anything I'd seen in 15 years of pharmacy practice, Sullivan testified. The compounds he was prescribing weren't available through normal pharmaceutical channels. When I researched them, I discovered they were experimental drugs that hadn't been approved for human use. Casey's testimony was emotional but devastating. She described her gradual loss of energy, memory problems, and growing confusion, symptoms that had mysteriously begun to improve only after she stopped seeing McGrath. I trusted Dr. McGrath completely, Casey said, her voice strong despite the difficulty of reliving her ordeal. I thought he was helping me. I never imagined that someone I trusted with my health was actually poisoning me. The prosecution presented evidence from 43 victims of McGrath's experiments. 12 had died from complications directly related to the experimental compounds. The survivors described months or years of declining health, mysterious symptoms, and treatments that seemed to make them worse rather than better. Walter Rowe testified about his wife Joyce's experience, describing how McGrath had convinced them that her symptoms were caused by a rare autoimmune condition that required experimental treatment. Dr. McGrath preyed on our desperation, Walter said. When someone you love is suffering and a doctor offers hope, you want to believe them. He used our trust to turn my wife into a laboratory rat. The most damaging testimony came from former Apex pharmaceutical employees who had turned state's evidence. Dr. Charles Boyd, a former researcher for the company, described the systematic targeting of vulnerable women for illegal drug trials. McGrath was our most productive field researcher, Boyd testified. He had perfected a method of identifying women who were unlikely to question their medical treatment and whose families lacked the resources to investigate when things went wrong. Boyd revealed that McGrath's operation had been part of a larger program to develop chemical agents for population control and biological warfare. The compounds being tested were designed to cause neurological degradation that would appear to be natural disease progression. The applications were primarily military, Boyd explained. Intelligence agencies wanted substances that could be used to incapacitate enemy populations without leaving obvious evidence of chemical warfare. Throughout the trial, McGrath sat silently at the defense table, his condition preventing him from actively participating in his own defense. His lawyers argued that the neurological damage he'd suffered made him incompetent to stand trial, but court-appointed medical experts determined that he retained sufficient cognitive function to understand the proceedings. Tyler found a grim satisfaction in watching McGrath struggle to follow the testimony. The doctor was experiencing firsthand the confusion and helplessness his victims had endured, unable to fully comprehend the magnitude of his crimes, but aware enough to understand that his life was effectively over. The defense's case was weak and perfunctory. McGrath's lawyers couldn't deny the evidence of his crimes, so they attempted to portray him as a researcher who had gotten caught up in a conspiracy beyond his control. Dr. McGrath was a brilliant physician who was manipulated by powerful interests, his attorney argued during closing statements. He believed he was conducting legitimate research that would ultimately help people. Prosecutor McLaughlin's closing argument was a masterpiece of controlled fury. She systematically demolished any suggestion that McGrath was anything other than a calculating predator who had betrayed the most fundamental principles of medical ethics. Dr. McGrath didn't just violate the Hippocratic Oath, she told the jury. He perverted it. Instead of first, do no harm, his motto was first, see how much harm you can do without getting caught. He turned healing into torture and medicine into murder. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts: conspiracy, racketeering, murder in the second degree, and numerous counts of assault and medical malpractice. As the verdicts were read, Tyler watched McGrath's face for any sign of reaction. The doctor's expression remained blank, his damaged nervous system preventing him from fully processing what was happening to him. Judge Wesley Landry sentenced McGrath to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 200 years for his crimes. The judge's comments during sentencing reflected the magnitude of McGrath's betrayal of public trust. Dr. McGrath, you have committed crimes that strike at the very heart of our society's faith in the medical profession, Judge Landry said. You turned the healing arts into instruments of torture and death. The neurological condition you now suffer appears to be the result of exposure to the same compounds you used to poison your victims. While I cannot approve of vigilante justice, I cannot say that your current condition is undeserved. Tyler allowed himself a small smile at the judge's words. Even the legal system recognized that McGrath was receiving exactly the justice his crimes deserved. After the sentencing, Tyler was approached by reporters seeking his reaction to the verdict. Justice has been served, Tyler said simply. Dr. McGrath will spend the rest of his life in prison, experiencing the same neurological decline he inflicted on his victims. I can't think of a more appropriate punishment for someone who used his medical knowledge to cause suffering instead of preventing it. Outside the courthouse, Tyler was reunited with Casey, who had been waiting with other victims' families. She looked healthier than she had in over a year, her energy and mental clarity fully restored after months of recovery. It's over, Tyler said, holding his wife close. No, Casey replied, looking back at the courthouse where McGrath would spend his remaining years. Now it begins. We're going to make sure this never happens to anyone else. Tyler nodded, thinking about the civil lawsuits that would follow, the congressional investigations that were already beginning, and the regulatory changes that would result from McGrath's crimes. But for now, Tyler Peters was content with the knowledge that he had used his skills to protect the woman he loved and bring down a monster who had thought himself untouchable. The trap had been set, sprung, and closed with a thoroughness that would serve as a warning to anyone else who might consider targeting innocent people for their own twisted purposes. Justice, Tyler reflected, was simply a matter of making sure people experienced the appropriate consequences of their actions. And Dr. Elias McGrath would spend every remaining day of his life learning exactly what those consequences looked like. 1 year after McGrath's conviction, Tyler Peters stood in the conference room of a Washington, D.C. law firm, addressing a congressional subcommittee investigating illegal medical experimentation. The room was packed with reporters, victims' families, and government officials who had been shaken by the scope of the conspiracy Tyler had helped expose. The McGrath case wasn't an isolated incident, Tyler testified. It was part of a systematic program that treated American citizens as expendable test subjects. Our investigation identified at least 200 victims across 12 states, with connections to pharmaceutical companies in 6 countries. Tyler had become the unofficial spokesman for McGrath's victims, using his analytical skills and media presence to push for legislative changes that would prevent similar conspiracies in the future. The Peters Protocol, named in his honor, now required enhanced oversight of experimental drug trials and mandatory reporting of unusual prescription patterns. Casey sat in the gallery, watching her husband with pride. Her recovery had been complete, and she'd returned to her nursing career with a new passion for patient advocacy. Together, they had established the Casey Peters Foundation for Medical Ethics, which provided support for victims of medical abuse and funded research into detecting illegal human experimentation. Mr. Peters, asked Congresswoman Marie Jacobs, what changes do you believe are necessary to prevent another McGrath situation? Tyler leaned forward, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had personally dismantled a criminal conspiracy. We need mandatory cross-referencing of prescription databases across state lines. We need criminal background checks for doctors who relocate frequently. And we need to close the loopholes that allow foreign pharmaceutical companies to fund research that would be illegal in their own countries. After the hearing, Tyler was approached by Special Agent Jacqueline Hunt, who had led the FBI investigation into McGrath's network. Tyler, I wanted to thank you personally, Agent Hunt said. Your work helped us identify and prosecute the largest medical fraud conspiracy in U.S. history. 47 people have been convicted, and we've recovered over $200 million in illegally obtained research funding. Tyler nodded, thinking about the price that had been paid for those convictions. 12 women had died, and dozens of others had suffered permanent health consequences from McGrath's experiments. But their sacrifices had exposed a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of government and international commerce. What about McGrath himself? Tyler asked. How's he doing? Agent Hunt's expression hardened. He's in maximum security at the Federal Medical Center in Springfield. His neurological condition has continued to deteriorate. He requires constant care and supervision, can barely speak coherently, and has trouble recognizing people from day to day. Tyler felt no sympathy for McGrath's condition. The doctor was experiencing exactly what he had intended for his victims, a slow, irreversible decline that would continue until his death. It was justice in its purest form. The irony is that McGrath's own research notes have been invaluable in treating his surviving victims, Agent Hunt continued. His detailed documentation of the poisoning process helped our medical team develop protocols for reversing the neurological damage in patients who received similar treatments. After the meeting, Tyler and Casey drove through Washington's evening traffic toward their hotel. They had plans to meet with other victims' families for dinner, continuing the support network that had formed during the investigation and trial. Do you ever think about what would have happened if Joe Sullivan hadn't warned us? Casey asked as they walked through Georgetown's historic streets. Tyler considered the question seriously. I think about it every day. McGrath's timeline suggested you had maybe 2 more weeks before the terminal phase protocol. If Sullivan hadn't risked his career to warn us, he didn't finish the sentence. Both of them understood how close they had come to a very different ending. Sometimes I wonder if there was another way, Casey said quietly. A way that didn't require you to do what you did to McGrath. Tyler stopped walking and turned to face his wife. Casey, McGrath was planning to start experimenting on children. Kids with learning disabilities whose parents were desperate enough to try anything. If I had just reported him to the authorities, how many children would have suffered while the bureaucracy moved slowly? How many would have died? Casey nodded, understanding the impossible choice Tyler had faced. I know you did what you had to do. It's just, sometimes I worry about what it cost you. Tyler smiled, thinking about the man he had been before discovering McGrath's crimes. Focused on spreadsheets and quarterly reports, content with a quiet suburban life. That man had been forced to become something harder and more dangerous when the people... It cost me some illusions about how the world works, Tyler admitted. But it taught me that sometimes ordinary people have to do extraordinary things to protect what matters most. At dinner, Tyler and Casey were joined by Walter and Joyce Rowe, Joe Sullivan and his wife, and several other families whose lives had been torn apart by McGrath's experiments. The conversation was both celebration and remembrance. joy at justice served, but sorrow for the women who hadn't survived to see their tormentor brought down. "I keep thinking about Amanda McLaughlin," said Joyce Rowe. "She was the same age as my daughter. If we had figured out what McGrath was doing just a few weeks earlier." Joe Sullivan, who had been quietly drinking his coffee, spoke up. "I should have acted sooner. I noticed the irregularities months before I warned Tyler. If I had been braver, Amanda and the others might still be alive." Tyler shook his head. "Joe, you saved lives by speaking up when you did. Without your warning, Casey would have died, and McGrath's operation would have continued indefinitely. You did the right thing." The pharmacist looked older than his 57 years, carrying the weight of knowledge that had come too late for some of McGrath's victims. But his testimony had been crucial in exposing the conspiracy, and his courage in breaking patient confidentiality laws had provided the evidence needed to bring down the entire network. As the evening wound down, Tyler reflected on the unexpected community that had formed around their shared trauma. Walter Rowe had become a close friend, bonding with Tyler over their shared experience of nearly losing their wives to a monster masquerading as a healer. Joe Sullivan had left pharmacy practice to work for the FDA, using his expertise to detect fraudulent prescription patterns. Even the prosecutors and FBI agents had become part of their extended family, united by their commitment to preventing similar crimes. The next morning, Tyler and Casey visited Arlington National Cemetery, where a memorial had been erected for victims of illegal medical experimentation. Amanda McLaughlin's name was engraved in black granite alongside 11 other women who had died as a result of McGrath's crimes. Casey placed flowers at the memorial while Tyler stood silently, thinking about the responsibility that came with survival. He had been given the skills and opportunity to stop McGrath, and he had used them effectively. But the weight of that success would stay with him forever. "Do you think we made a difference?" Casey asked as they walked back to their car. Tyler looked back at the memorial, where other visitors were reading the names of women who had trusted the wrong doctor. "I think we made sure that McGrath can never hurt anyone again. I think we exposed a conspiracy that would have continued killing people if we hadn't acted. And I think we've made it harder for the next McGrath to operate with impunity." It wasn't a complete victory. Nothing could bring back the women who had died or fully heal the trauma experienced by the survivors. But it was justice served by ordinary people who had refused to accept that monsters could operate without consequences. As they drove home to Chicago, Tyler's phone buzzed with a message from Agent Hunt. "New case in Oregon shows similar patterns to McGrath operation. Can you consult?" Tyler showed the message to Casey, who nodded grimly. "How many more are out there?" "We'll find out," Tyler replied, already thinking about the analytical work that would be needed to identify another potential conspiracy. "And when we do, we'll stop them." Tyler Peters had learned that evil often flourished because good people chose to look away or trust systems that were designed to be exploited. He had also learned that one person with the right skills and sufficient motivation could bring down even the most sophisticated criminal enterprise. The next McGrath was out there somewhere, preying on vulnerable people and hiding behind professional credentials. But Tyler Peters was also out there, along with Casey and their growing network of allies who understood that some fights were worth any cost. The trap had been set, sprung, and closed on Dr. Elias McGrath. Now, it was time to start building the next one. Tyler Peters had found his calling, and it was more important than any corporate analysis he'd ever conducted. Some puzzles were worth solving regardless of the personal cost, and some victories were measured not in profit margins, but in lives saved. The road ahead would be difficult and dangerous, but Tyler faced it with the confidence of a man who had already proven that intelligence, determination, and moral clarity could triumph over the most sophisticated evil. McGrath was finished. His network was destroyed, and the next predator would learn that Tyler Peters and his allies were watching, waiting, and ready to deliver the justice that the system sometimes failed to provide. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. and I'll see you there.